Good morning. How are y'all? Good. So to answer Frank's question earlier about whether or not I sleep, the answer is I do not at all, like zero. My wife is probably worse than I am, as we are averaging right now anywhere between 3 to 4 hours of sleep a night, and it has been that way for the past week with no looking like it's going to end anytime soon. So I actually, truth be told, I got super lucky last night in that my oldest, so Haven, my 2-year-old, decided to wake up in the middle of the night and was wide awake. So you know what that meant? That meant I get to go like sleep in her room and put her to bed, okay? Which actually mean at like 3 o'clock in the morning I walked in there and then I slept the rest of the night and didn't get woken up. So that's pretty nice, you know? Because I was like, hey, you got to stay here with the baby, but I can at least go take care of the other one. So good luck. So anyways, with that being said, I'm a little on the tired side. I've been a little bit on the tired side for the past week. In fact, I was so tired yesterday when I came up to work. I was working with Jacob outside, and I leaned up against one of the walls of the tent, and I closed my eyes, and I woke up and did not remember how long I was leaning there. So, needless to say, I'm tired, but when we made this schedule on how we were going to break this down, I thought, hey man, this is like 2 weeks before my baby comes. Last time my baby come a week late. That should be good. Yeah, well, obviously not. So, anyways, I am teaching, and I'm really glad today that I get to teach specifically about this institution. And let me say this. About 6 months ago, I stood on this stage and made a very bold proclamation, which was, I will continue to preach the gospel, I will continue to have this building open, we will continue to do these things, and if the government shuts us down, I will gladly go to jail. Well, now the Lord, in His infinite wisdom, has seen fit that I, the man that made that public statement, am now the one to teach about government. And it is almost like, for some strange reason, I always get the government topic as if I went to school for it or something. And for those of you that don't know, I actually have a degree in political science, and it's like an awesome paperweight. So, with that being said, let's get started. So we're going to continue on our talking about Reboot. And today, like I said, we're going to focus on government. So the first little bit of this is just going to be recap over these institutions. So the institutions, right? The following biblical foundations of God-created establishments are designed and created for the protection, preservation of humanity, as well as people groups and societies within our world, which are composed of both believers and unbelievers, right? So God has made these institutions to be a benefit for all of mankind, and there are 5 of them, right? And we've already talked about 3 of them. We're going to talk about 4, and Frank is going to finish up on the last next week. So the first one we talked about is personal responsibility. The next one we talked about is marriage, then family. We're going to talk about government today, and we're going to talk about people groups there. But as we've seen, within each and every one of these, God created this, and then mankind messed it up. God created it, and then mankind messed it up. God created it, and then mankind messed it up. In Psalms chapter 11, verse 3, this is what it says. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The foundation is destroyed, what can the righteous do? Well, here's our answer. We can reboot. We can change the way that we begin to think about these institutions. And so, I'm going to echo of what Frank talked last week in Timothy and just say this is going to be my charge today, because today I want to try to do something which is going to be very difficult for everyone sitting in this room. I want you to take all of your previous knowledge and put it to the side and listen to what the Word of God says. Okay? Because this is what 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1 through 5 says. I solemnly charge you in the presence of God and of Christ, who is the judge of the living and the dead, by the appearing of His kingdom, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with great patience and instruction. That is going to be my goal for today. Because we live in a time that this is true. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting their ears tickled, wanting their needs to be satisfied, they will accumulate for themselves teachers according to their own desires, and they will turn their ears away from the truth and will turn aside to myths. But you, be sober in all things, endure hardships, do the work of the evangelist, and fulfill the ministry. And so, what my aim to do today is, in speaking about government, is to be able to teach the most biblically sound teaching that I can possibly do. With me saying that, we're going to encounter a couple of problems. And most of those problems are the way we think. And so, let's start. Really, when you begin to talk about government, there's one sort of standout passage in the Bible, and that's Romans chapter 13. There's a couple other ones, but if you want to look for just doctrinally the best foundational statement, the best foundational doctrinal point, this is where it is. And so, we are going to spend our entire time today dissecting and looking at this passage. Because if we understand what it says in Romans chapter 13, we begin to understand a lot. Because government affects every person all the time. Literally affects you all the time. All the time. And you're like, well, how does government affect me all the time? It affects you all the time. Driving here, it affected you. Waking up in the morning, it affected you. Right now, who do you think did daylight savings time, huh? Whole bunch of guys sitting around weren't deciding, hey, you know what, we're just going to change this. No, the government did it. Why do you think a state doesn't do it? They're like, this is dumb, silly, we're not going to do this. What we understand is that when we begin to look at the framework and the context of government and the way that it affects us and affects our everyday life, it affects your house, it affects your job, it affects the way you eat, it affects every aspect of you. There is not a piece of food you put in your mouth unless you grew it that the government didn't have a hand in somewhere. They didn't. Unless you grew it yourself, the government has checked out that food. Unless, right, you like teleported here, you had to get here via a car. What happened? When you got in your car is literally filled with government regulation. You drove here, literally filled with government regulation. You walked in this building, which was built with governmental regulation, right? We are standing under power, which is government regulation. Every aspect of our lives in some way is intertwined with this concept of government. And because of that, it's really key and important that we understand the biblical foundation of government and what Paul means to say about it and what believers are meant to do. So let's read through all of this and then we'll begin to break it down. Therefore, whoever resists authority... Sorry, jumping ahead. Oh, no, I'm not. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, Nope, I did jump ahead because you're missing verse 1 in my own slides. Hold on. Nope, that's totally mine. We didn't proof it well enough last night. Okay, Bible. We're doing this old school. This is awesome preaching right here. Me flipping through a Bible. Okay. Everyone must submit to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist are instituted by God. And now we can pick up. So, right? Yeah. I'm just going to continue to read. So then, one who resists authority is opposing God, and the commands of those who oppose it will bring judgment upon themselves. For the rulers are not cause of fear, but for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority, do what is good, and you will be praised for the same. 4, it is a servant of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a servant of God, the avenger of those who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of its wrath, but for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. To all, pay to all what is due to them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, respect to whom respect, honor to whom honor. So let me talk about this real quick. Humanity has been given a very clear sort of guide concerning the role of government in our world. And this guide has been neglected and ignored by society, but by especially Christians. And so I want to give 3 reasons on why I think we as a society have neglected this. Here's the first one, Western American thought. And this is where I'm going to ask you to take what you think and begin to put it to the side and listen to the Word of God. If you were raised in this country, or if you were raised in another westernized country, you have been spent your entire life understanding political systems. All of those political systems are super modernized. All of those political systems have within them intrinsic rights and values. However, some of these rights and values are not biblical rights and values. Some of these rights and values that we have as citizens are not guaranteed in the Bible. And because of that, it gives us a skewed version of government. I'll use an example of this, right? Limited governmental authority. Limited governmental authority. We, as westernized people, view limited governmental authority to be a rather good thing, right? Government can't come in and say, do this, do this, do this. They at least have to give me a reason. Paul is writing this letter from prison for doing nothing wrong. Right? And what is he telling you to do? Submit to authority. We, having done this, right, having had hundreds of years of sort of political thinking and education, have now changed the way we think about politics and the way we think about government, but the way that the Bible thinks about government is very black and white, and there's not a whole lot of gray. We live in a political system that's a whole lot of gray. So number 1, we have this problem with Western or American thought. Number 2, we also have a problem with political polarization. And what do I mean by that? There is a lot of Christians, and maybe some in this room, who are more sure of their political party than they are of the Word of God. 100% fact. You will share a political ideal before you will share the Word of God. You will share your political thought way before you will open up the Bible. Well, guess what? Your political party will not get you into heaven. If anything, it'll just further your way to hell. Both sides, right? And the final one that I think gets in the way of properly understanding government, especially as Americans, are our wonderful political rights. Because guess what is not guaranteed in this Bible? Your rights. Aside maybe from the right of life, you don't have many that are guaranteed in here, right? I'll use an example. You guys know what the Fifth Amendment is, right? It's prosecution without evidence, right? Pretty much. Our government says we will not prosecute you without you first going before a grand jury, and the grand jury must have some evidence. You know what the Bible doesn't guarantee? That. Because when you look at Jesus, they didn't have a whole lot of evidence. They started making up stuff as they went. When you look at all the apostles, sort of the same thing. You know what else? I don't know, like the Sixth Amendment, right? Public trial. We aren't guaranteed a public trial. Bible never says, you know what, when a government official wrongs you, you are now entitled to a public trial. Nope. Paul didn't get no public trial. He was just rotting in jail, right? You didn't have a right to a jury. You didn't have a right to bail. Even our freedom of speech. We are so incredibly blessed as a nation to get up and to say what you think. When Paul is writing this letter, if Paul got up and said, hey, Caesar's dumb and his policies are awful, they're going to cut off his head. I mean, they cut off his head anyways. But, it would have happened immediately. Okay? See, some of the things that when we view this book and then we read in American values and American rights into it. And what you need to understand about the role of government is that these rights aren't in the Bible. Mankind has made them. Meaning what? They may very well be good, but they are not guaranteed by God. God is never sitting there guaranteeing, hey, you know what's going to happen? The government official that deals with you is going to be fair and just, and you're going to have a right to a trial. Doesn't happen. Okay? We, as Americans, view this. I have, sitting right here, I have 2 Nigerian friends. Okay? We have talked multiple times about the police in Nigeria opposed to the police in America. Right? And you know what they've both said? Hey, if a police officer stops you in Nigeria, you do whatever they say. They say, get out of the car, you get out of the car. They say, do this, you do this. You don't talk back. You never talk back. Guys, I'm a white boy from Texas, okay? If a police officer pulls me over and I don't think he knows what he's doing, I'm asking questions, okay? Hey, officer, why'd you pull me over? I wasn't speeding. I was doing the speed limit. I got this. Okay? A white boy from Texas, okay, going to try to argue with the police officer. I'll probably fail in it, right? But you know what I understand? That as an American citizen, I have certain rights. People from other countries, you know what they understand? When an authority stops you, you do whatever that authority says. And so, now I want to break down what it is Paul is trying to get to. And the first, right, we're going to look at the first verse, right? Romans chapter 13, verse 1. Every person is to be subject to the governing authorities. Every person be subject to the governing authorities. There are 3 statements here which give out the entire principle of the institution of government. And what is that? The main principle of the institution of government is this: let every soul be subject to a higher power. Let every soul be subject to a higher power. This phrase, every soul, is translated to like every person. Meaning what? Every single person needs to be subject to a higher power. Literally meaning, right, the authority who has authority over us. That's the higher power. The people who have authority over us, which would be government, and would actually be every phrase of government. From your police officer, to your county judge, to your mayor, to your city council, to your state senators, to your governor, then to your U.S. senators, and your U.S. election, and your president, and your Supreme Court justices, and your federal judges. We are to be subject. This statement means that they are to be over us, right? There's no qualifications, right? It's unlimited, it's unconditional. Meaning, within these 3 statements, it's unqualified, unlimited, and unconditional. Every person is subject to them, whether you want to be or not. There's never going to become a case where you're like, well, this government official does not have authority over me. Well, why? Why is that? Because what this says is, if they have authority over you, they have authority over you. God's not granting them not having authority over you because you don't like what they have to say. There is a lot of people that I know that do not like laws, especially in this current climate, that a government official says you need to follow. And so what you do is, I'm just not going to follow them. They don't have the authority to tell me that. Says who? Says who? Because what God says is every person is to be subject to the governing authorities. Somehow, God put them there. Meaning, they're in a position of authority. And this applies to every soul on the earth. And so what Paul does in the rest of this is he gives 7 logical reasons on why we are to be subject to governing authorities. Why we are to obey and listen and follow our leaders. And so our first sort of logical right is explained in the second half of verse 1. For there is no authority except God, and those which exist are established by God. Meaning, what is the first logical reason on why we should be submissive, on why we should be subject to authority? Well, that's easy. Government is directly decreed by God. Government is directly decreed by God. All government is directly decreed by God. Good government, bad government, directly decreed. In a couple of days, you're going to have an election. And I can tell you, as somebody who has studied elections a lot, that nobody knows what's going to happen. That nobody knows what's going to happen. Right? All of your polls predict X. And as somebody who spent a lot of time, because in college I had Elections 101, right? Results in understanding election and results in polling, right? Which was 9 hours, class hours of my life that if I could get back, I would love it, right? Spent looking at election results and polling. What I can tell you is polls most of the time are accurate, except in 2016 when it just nosedived, which then sent everybody who has a nifty degree in political science saying, I don't know what I'm doing, right? Well, guess what? Regardless of who wins, whether that be President Trump or former Vice President Biden, God has decreed them to now be sitting in the position of power. And why do I say that? Because all authority is derived from God. All authority is derived from God. And power from that authority reflects the purposes of God. And we'll talk about what the purposes of God are in a little bit for government. And because of those two things, governmental power is divinely ordained by God. God has established this for us because it is good for mankind. Logical point number 2. Therefore, whoever resists the authority has opposed the ordinance of God. Meaning what? Resistance to government is flat out rebellion against God. Resistance to government is flat out rebellion against God. And this is where it begins to get tricky, because I found this lesson both incredibly validating and incredibly convicting. And I will tell you why. Because as I literally made this point, I remember a conversation I had with my nephew. My nephew is 13 now, and when he was 11, we were going somewhere, and my dad's going to remember this. I was driving Caleb, who is my nephew, and we were driving, and I'm driving, so I'm speeding. And Caleb looks at me and says, Uncle Joseph, the speed limit is 60. And I said, hey, Caleb, it's more like a suggestion. And he says, Uncle Joseph, it's not a suggestion, it's a law. And I said, Caleb, when you get older, you'll understand. So we get to my dad's house, and Caleb gets out, and he says, Grandpa, Uncle Joseph said speed limits are a suggestion. And my dad says, no, Caleb, they're a law. See, like right there, okay? In that little moment, and Frank's listening to his office, like rolling over in his chair right now, right? In that moment, right? That's rebellion. Not rebellion against government, straight up rebellion against God. Why? Because if government is divinely decreed, then resistance against it is also to resist God. If God has established them, and then I say, I don't like what you say, I'm going to do what I want to say, God put them there, now I'm resisting. This would include most forms of civil disobedience. And notice the reason I use the term most forms, because later we'll talk about, I think, maybe the only right way that we can be civil disobedient, but right now I'm just going to leave most forms. Logical reason 3. Pick up. And they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. Meaning what? Meaning those that resist God will, or those that resist government will face judgment. Will face punishment. This word here for punishment means judgment. And guess what? When you break down the word, it includes both civil and divine judgment. Meaning what? If you break a law, not only are you sinning against God, but you're also sinning against a government official. So not only are you going to get a ticket, but then you also need to respond to God on why you got a ticket. And finally, let's go to 4, and this is probably the most meaty reason on why government exists. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. So, the role of government in society is always to restrain evil. The role of government in society is to restrain evil. Why? Because government understands basic morality, and government generally tends to preserve life and property. And this is good government and bad government. So I'll give an example of good government. Our government. Are we great? No. But compared to other nations, we're pretty good. If I go out and murder someone, I'm going to face punishment. However, there are countries that I would not step foot in, which crime rates are lower than America. You want to know why? Because they also understand if you murder someone, it's bad. And if you murder someone, we'll just hang you in the street. Here's our trial. Did you kill him? Yep. Hang him. And you know what? That's a really good deterrent to crime. I do not want to go to a Middle Eastern country. I don't. You know what is genuinely true about most Middle Eastern countries? Their rule of law is excellent because their punishment is awful. So, people tend to not steal as much because they don't like losing limbs. People tend to not rape or murder as much. Why? Because they like to live. And typically, when that happens, they just commute your sentence. You're guilty? All right, there you go. You're gone. Government understands basic morality, sort of across the board. That's what you see with most governments. I don't know a government that exists that says, you know what, it's okay for you to murder someone. I don't know a government that exists that says, you know what, it's okay for you to rape someone. However, do you know what government ultimately does? It preserves and it fights against what I would refer to as mob rule. The most dangerous thing in a society is a society without any rules, because there's nothing restraining people. Our recent riots are a great example of that. Once a mob gets started, there is no more rule of law. That if you were to pull out individuals and put them all separate and say, hey, do you think it's a good idea that you burn down this building? Most of them would say, probably not really, especially considering the building belongs to somebody that's also probably in the crowd. But when you get the crowd riled up and you put them together, you no longer have control. That's how people get beat to death. That's how you get mobs that burn down city blocks. The most dangerous thing in a society isn't bad laws, it's no laws. Because man is wicked. And when you do not restrain mankind, mankind will do whatever they want. And they've always proven that. And so let's go to the fifth point. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a servant of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. So, on this one, government does two things. One, it promotes the common good, and B, it serves God ultimately by restraining evil. Government's design is to benefit its people. And for the most part, government does that. Like you can look at our society and say, I don't think our politicians serve the common good. And that's okay for you to say that. However, when you look at what our government does for people, and then you look at what governments do for other people in other parts of the world, it is undeniable that our government goes above and beyond in certain areas. It truly is. Why? Because ultimately, our government wants to make sure that its citizens are taken care of. Case in point, the Bill of Rights I complained about earlier. Right? They are designed to take care of citizens. They're designed to take care of you. Government tries its best to protect people that do good and to punish people that do bad. And so, I'll say this. I think that one of the greatest political writings that has ever come into existence was the Federalist Papers. Right? There were a group of papers written by our founding fathers at the beginning of our nation when we're trying to ratify the Constitution. If you ever want, it's not a fun read, but if you ever want a good read, then you should read them. Because I know a lot of people that read the Constitution, but they don't understand the thought behind the Constitution. Why did the Bill of Rights exist? Well, if you read these papers, they lay it out. And what I think is the most insightful of them is Federalist number 10. It's written by James Madison. And the whole concept of this is the role of government should be to protect its citizens, because what is most dangerous in a governing body is a majority. He referred to it as factions. And the reason he says that is because if I can get 51% of the people, we can now oppress 49% of the people, right? The reason that the Bill of Rights was made was not for the majority to use. It was to protect the minority. That's the reason that the Bill of Rights was made. It was not to protect the majority. It was to protect the people who there was legit fear, hey, once you create this federal government and it gets so powerful, well, now I've got 60% of the population that thinks one way and 40% that thinks another way. Well, now the 60% can just vote any way they want. And they can remove my rights and restrict my rights and take that away. And so our founding fathers said, hey, this is a problem, this is how we solve it. Why did they do that? Because they were trying to do this common function of government, which is to promote the common good of its citizens. Their aim is to help people. Which now brings me to 6, and arguably my favorite. For it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a servant of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Government has a right to punish, even with death. And what do I mean by that? They have every right to carry out whatever punishment they deem fits the crime. So I'll use an example of this that I studied in school. In 1994, there was a teenage boy. He was 16 years old, and his family was visiting Singapore. This boy was from Chicago and decided it would be an awesome idea to go and graffiti a couple street signs. Not a good idea in Singapore. He was caught. He then went to trial, and does anyone want to know his punishment? 4 months in jail and 6 public whacks of caning. And what you don't know what caning is, it's they take a cane pole, they tie you up in the square, and they hit you with it. That was the law in Singapore. Singapore prides itself on being super clean. That got back to America, and Americans were furious. We're like, you are going to take this 16-year-old boy and cane him up and tie him up in the street and cane him? And the government said, yeah, that's what we're going to do. And so the president got on the phone and said, hey, we're going to sanction you. This isn't good. You can't treat our citizen like this. And they said, hey, this boy's getting something. And so after this political incident, this is the punishment. They said, look, we'll let go of the jail time and we'll drop 2 of the canings. But the boy's got to do 4. And the boy, for a brief second, became a national hero. Why? Because this evil, tyrannical government decided to see fit that they would cane a 16-year-old boy for graffitiing 2 street signs. Now, do I think that the punishment may have been a little excessive? Yes. However, that is a sovereign nation with sovereign laws, and they can do whatever they want. Including the death penalty. I'm going to give you a hint. I don't like the death penalty. I don't. As a Christian, I struggle with it. I'll tell you why I struggle with the death penalty. Because I think the moment someone dies, if they don't know Christ, they're in hell. And that terrifies me. Don't want that on anyone. However, if somebody says, do you think God supports the death penalty? Well, of course, Genesis 9:6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. Doesn't matter what I think. Matters what God set up. As a Christian, it terrifies me. I don't want anyone to go to hell. Anyone. Like Hitler, I don't want Hitler to go to hell. I don't know if I want to be standing next to him. But I don't want anyone to be separated from God for eternity. But does the government have the right to institute the death penalty? Of course. Why? They are sovereign. God has placed them in a position of authority for both good and bad. And the last logical reason that we have government is this, right? Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For the sake of conscience. Now, this is an interesting one Because what he's really saying here is, it's good for you to be subject to government sort of as a form of ministry. It is good for you to be subject to people. I dislike when people tell me what to do. I dislike it. And I'll tell you why I dislike it. Because when the moment somebody tells me what to do, there's this fierce Joseph pride that creeps up and says, I know what I'm doing. Right? That fierce Joseph pride is almost always sinful. And you know what helps kill that pride? By being subject to something else. By being subject to someone else. The best way to minister to people, especially in the form of government, is to do what is good. In 1 Peter, he talks about this. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 15, this is what it says. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as to one in authority, or the governors as sent by him to punish evildoers and to praise those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you will silence the ignorance of foolish people. So what is the apostle saying here? Do what's good. And by doing it, and by doing what they say, and by following the law, you are going to make everyone who speaks against you foolish. Because you will have proven yourself. And so now, let me say the three, at this point, I've kind of outlined the framework of government. Government exists so that we would be subject to it. And they exist in that way so that they can restrain evil. They exist in that way because they're servants of God. They exist in that way because they promote the common good. And ultimately, they exist that way because God saw it fit to subjugate man to one another, so that man is not left to his own devices. However, there's a couple of problems that come up when I talk about this, and people say, I really struggle with the idea of submitting myself to a government, and I think they struggle with it for three different reasons, or those struggles take three different forms. And the first form is governmental mismanagement. There's a lot of people that I know that struggle with government when they think government is bad. Right? Meaning it's poor, it's unjust, it doesn't work for our good, and because of that, because the government is just awful, it leads to resentment, rebellion, and disobedience. And with that, I need to say one important thing. Regardless of how you feel about government, regardless of if you think government is managed good or managed bad, regardless of if you think government is just or unjust, fair or unfair, it doesn't matter. Your rebellion against it is just that, rebellion. It's sin. And why do I say that? Well, first off, I know that God causes kings and leaders to rise and fall. And I also understand that God is sovereign and he works all things for both good, or all things in both good and bad rulers for his purposes. So I want to give a couple of examples so that you understand this. Pharaoh is an example. I don't think anyone would look at Pharaoh and say, that's a good ruler. Because I think after about plague 2, a good ruler realizes, I'm outmatched here. You can go. Okay? But what did he do? God used his ignorance. God used his poor management. God used his sinful nature to benefit himself, to benefit his kingdom, to show the glory of God. I'll use Nero, for example. Nero is a Roman emperor. He's also probably the one that first implemented the large exodus of sort of Christian killing, right? Christian persecution in the Roman Empire. He killed probably more Christians in his reign than almost any other emperor did. In fact, he used to take Christians and tie them up and light them on fire outside of cities to use the Christian as a lamp. Yeah. But do you know what it forced Christians to do? Spread. They couldn't sit together anymore. They were getting hunted. So then they spread, and Christianity spread. Now, was that man wicked? Of course. Did God use that man's wickedness for his own good and for the benefit of his kingdom? Of course, because he's sovereign. Nothing happens in life that he doesn't know about. He doesn't condone evilness. He lets man do what man wants to do. But there's not an evil act that occurs that he's not saying, hey, that's a terrible act, but I now can use that act to benefit my kingdom. His death is the perfect example of this, right? Satan's hand is all over that. That's about the most evil act in human history. Ultimate good came from it. I'll use another ultimate evil act that Satan's hand was all over: the Holocaust and the persecution of the Jews. Do you know that one of the greatest benefits of the world came because of the Holocaust? We talked about Martin Luther earlier today. Martin Luther, when writing about Revelations, wrote, this has to be figurative or metaphorical, because if it was literal, it would mean that the Jews would have to be back in the nation of Israel, which is impossible. Guess what? The Jews are back in the nation of Israel. Guess why the Jews are back in the nation of Israel? Because of the Holocaust. If the Holocaust didn't exist, they wouldn't be there. Like, make no bones about it, if you don't kill 6 million Jews, the Jews don't get their own homeland. You kill 6 million of them, and the world says, oh man, we messed up here. What do you guys want? You guys want land? Here's land. Ultimately, whether governments run good or run bad, whether leaders are good or bad, ultimately it's working for his purpose, and he knows that. The next sort of problem that people have is just simple civil disobedience. The active refusal for citizens to obey certain laws, demands, or orders that a government gives them. Speed limit. Paying your taxes. There's like really simple things. The code on your house. There are really simple ways that people look at this and they say, well, the government doesn't have a right here, and so I'm just going to be civil disobedient. Like, I'm just not going to listen to what they have to say. Guys, that's straight up rebellion against God. That is rebellion against God in every sense of the word. However, I said earlier, most forms of civil disobedience. Because as I read the scripture, I find one form of civil disobedience to jump out. Oh, hey, Jacob, I'm going to skip this. Just talking about paying taxes, give respect. I find one form of civil disobedience to jump out at me. The only form of civil disobedience that we see in the Bible, throughout the Bible, is focused around government opposing the worship, teaching, or sharing of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Or God, Yahweh. And why do I say that? Well, the only time you see these men that are saying, submit to government authorities, not submit to government authorities, is when it comes to God. And then at which point, they fall and say, I must honor God over honoring man. But I want you to look at that and see how narrow of a scope that is. That's like a super narrow scope. That means if I read this book, okay, and God tells me to do something, I do it. If God doesn't tell me to do something, and my government says you have to do that, and I say, I don't want to do that, You may not have a biblical leg to stand on. And you can argue all sort of personal freedoms. Well, that's cool. But I don't know if you can argue biblical freedoms. Here is a personal example I'll give in this time. The lockdown order. I think it's about as silly can be most of the time. However, does the government official have every right to do this? Yes. With the avenue of one major thing. They can't stop you from worshiping Jesus. Can they stop you from going to work? Yep. They stopped Paul from working, they threw him in jail. All right? Can they stop you from hanging out with friends? Yep. They stopped Christians from meeting. Can they stop us from doing all sorts of other normal daily activities, going to the park, hanging out outside? Sure. And I don't know if you can sit here and say, well, God gave me the right to go walk my dog. God gave me the right to not listen to government authorities because they don't know what they're talking about. That very well might be the case, okay? If you look at our current political landscape, I don't know if there's too many government authorities I would put as intellectual geniuses, okay? But regardless, God has put them there. And unless their law directly contradicts what is in this book, then anything other than that is sinful. Which then brings me to my last problem, civil dissidence, right? This is sort of aggressive rebellion against God, or aggressive rebellion against government. So what I need to do is I need everyone to take a deep breath real quick because I might get a little personal. Okay, I put this one in on purpose. And here's why I put this one in on purpose. Because in our current political landscape, there's a lot of political polarization that goes on. And a lot of political polarization that goes on, we find ourselves in this spot of insulting. We find ourselves in this spot of degrading. We find ourselves in this spot of saying this politician is a fraud and doesn't know what the heck they are talking about. I said earlier about the freedom of speech. Our Constitution gives us the freedom of speech. God does not give you the freedom of speech to make fun of your leaders. God does not give you the freedom of speech to talk about how you think Senator X is a dummy. God does not give you the freedom of speech to stand up and to make fun of other governmental leaders. God does not give you the freedom of speech to riot and to rebel. God does not give you the freedom to take up arms and to fight against governmental authority. He doesn't. When you look at it, every form of civil disobedience, this is what they say. I'm going to preach the gospel. No, you're not going to preach the gospel. Then throw me in jail. You know what you never see happen? I'm going to preach the gospel. No, you're not. I'm going to take up my sword and fight you to preach the gospel. You don't see that. Instead, what you see is submission even to the point of death. And that's a super difficult concept. And here's why. I have two verses for us that I want to look at. Verse 1 is in Titus chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. Remind them to be subject to rulers and to authorities, to be obedient, and to be ready for every good deed, to slander no one, not to be contentious, to be gentle, showing consideration to all people. When's the last time you had a political discussion with somebody that you would label as gentle? When is the last time, right, you saw a good political discussion that didn't try to slander your opponent or the opponent? Guess what? As a Christian, you do not have that right to do that. That is sin. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. First of all, then, I urge you that request, prayer, intercession, and thanksgiving be made on behalf of all people and for the king and all who are in authority, so that we may live tranquil, quiet lives in all godliness and dignity. This is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who wants all people to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. So what does he call Christians to do? I'll give you a hint: to lead tranquil and quiet lives with all godliness and dignity. That's not starting riots. That's not throwing bombs at other people that you don't agree with politically. Goes both ways. And what are you called to do? You are called to make all requests, prayer, and intercession and thanksgiving for all people, including the kings and who are in authority. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about sort of a biblical calling for Christians. How do we react in the framework of government? And I think the first way that we react in the framework of government is we become model citizens. We work in society towards our common good. We work for peace within society. And most importantly, we don't speak ill of leaders, even sometimes when the leader deserves it. And that's really hard to do. It is really hard to do to not speak ill of somebody that you disagree with. But that is exactly what Christians are called to do. So Joe Wall came up here. Jacob, when did Joe come? It was about a month ago? Yeah? Scott, his son, came with him. Scott works for Capital Commission. Scott's whole ministry is devoted to working with our state senators and our state House representatives, right? That's his ministry. Paul has Bible studies. Scott has Bible studies. He's looking at all of this, trying to get them in. Do you know what one thing he never does? Never disagrees. Well, he doesn't never disagree with them. He never insults them. Do you want to know why he doesn't insult them? And he has both Democrats and Republicans coming to his Bible study. Because the quickest way to turn somebody off to the gospel is to insult them about the gospel. The quickest way to turn off somebody to God is to insult them about it. And so, he brings them all in. His goal is to affect policy, but to affect policy by showing them what God says. Nothing else. So first, be a model citizen. Second, this is huge. We are actually called to follow the laws of government, even if those laws are dumb. There's a lot of dumb laws, okay? One of the things you should do, and I encourage you if you don't think that there's dumb laws, is just like Google one time, like dumb laws in like Wisconsin or something. And you'll find these laws which are written in like 1880, which are still on the books, that's like you can't ride a bear. And you're like, hold on. You mean to tell me somebody wrote a bear, so they had to make a law? Right? There's all sorts of dumb laws, including paying, this is also paying your taxes. You're called to give what is due. That includes taxes. Even if you don't want to pay taxes, nobody alive wants to pay taxes. Nobody in Paul's day wanted to pay taxes. And like if you think taxes are bad now, at least they're a little bit more honest than Paul's day, right? I mean, Jesus has an interaction with the tax collector, and the tax collector leaves there, and he says, I have cheated so many people. I'm going to give all my money to the poor and then give back to everyone fourfold because of how much I've cheated them. The IRS may be pretty crooked. I don't know if the IRS is intentionally trying to cheat you. Next, we are called as Christians to pray and encourage all leaders. We are called to pray for the people that God has appointed over us, regardless of policy, competency, or personality. And so here is my challenge to you today. If you find yourself complaining way more about government officials and you find yourself praying about government officials, there's probably an imbalance. If you find yourself complaining way more about your laws and your rules and about what the judge is going to say, then you probably need to spend way more time praying. The final one. We are to live our lives in the way that glorifies Jesus Christ. And by that, I mean, we need to focus on what the Bible says. We need to focus on spreading the gospel and a little bit less on political ideals. It's not wrong to want justice for people. It's not wrong to fight for these things. But if you devote your life to those things, with the exclusion of the gospel, you have devoted your life to make someone's temporary stay better when you could have made sure that their eternal home is secure. Government wasn't meant to be this evil boogeyman. Government was never meant to be this thing that people hate or despise. Government has always meant to be a benefit for mankind. And the reason that they're a benefit is because God has put them over us to control mankind from itself. Because when mankind is uncontrolled, mankind is crazy. It's crazy. And so, today, will you reboot your thinking of government? Will you reboot your understanding of government today? And will you allow the Spirit to begin to transform us into citizens whose life is a testimony to Jesus Christ? Is a testimony to Jesus Christ. You will deal with government for the rest of your life. There is no getting around it. But government is not necessarily a bad thing. What it is it's something that God has put in place for us to work through the confines of for the benefit of mankind. And ultimately, it has allowed us, especially in our tremendously blessed nation, to share the gospel. We have a wonderful nation in comparison to the rest of the world, in the fact that we can get up every day and share the gospel. And there is a ton of nations, there is a ton of sovereign states that's an impossibility. And so because of that, we should be a little bit thankful. But we shouldn't use our freedom that we have been given as a means of sin. Rather, we should use our freedom as a means to glorify God's institution and to glorify God himself, to support what God has established by praying and encouraging and working for the betterment of our society and for the gospel of Jesus Christ.